That is the question, heavy, unsettling, and ridiculous yet terrifying, that drifts through the cold dark of the void. Somewhere between forgotten stars and the distant roar of a dying sun, something stirs. Something ancient, loud, and brutally alive. And as the question echoes, something answers, not with words, but with a rumbling growl that vibrates through metal plates, cracked hulls, and the bones of dead worlds. For this is not a whisper of philosophers or scholars. This is the earliest heartbeat of the Orks. A pulse made of violence, hunger, and boundless, unstoppable energy. Long before the first Imperial scribe put quill to parchment, before the Eldar mapped their star lanes, even before the Necrons learned to fear their own soulless immortality, there was a crude and furious order taking shape in the shadows of creation. A race engineered by long-forgotten godlike beings, built not for peace, not for reason, but for war. War without purpose, war without end, war so constant and so deafening that it became their language, their faith, and their only dream. Life began for the Orks not as individuals but as spores drifting across barren rock, burrowing into soil like tiny promises of destruction. And from these spores rose the first primitive forms, small, violent creatures that fought over scraps of fungus and dirt, smashing skulls and ripping limbs with no understanding of why they felt so compelled. They were born fighting, they lived fighting, and when they died, their bodies fed the ground, creating more spores, birthing even more violence. A perfect cycle of brutality, echoing endlessly across the galaxy. These early proto-orcs, the Krurk before the age of forgetting, were not yet the green-skinned bellowing beasts the galaxy would later come to dread. They were something greater, warriors built by the Old Ones to fight a cosmic war that predated the Imperium by millions of years. Their muscles were thicker, their minds sharper, their goals clearer. But as eons passed and the universe itself fractured under endless conflict, the Krurk slowly devolved. Their intelligence crumbled, replaced by instinct and raw aggression. Their culture decayed into brawls. Their ancient strategies collapsed into loud, chaotic charges. Yet through all this, one thing remained: they fought. Always. As stars died and ancient empires fell, the Orks endured. Their spores crawled into the cracks of ruined civilizations, sprouting tribes in the ashes of forgotten cities. They spread like an infection, an unstoppable bloom of green that stained the galaxy's surface with conflict. Worlds that had once been peaceful outposts became arenas for ceaseless brawls. Planets once known for scientific discovery became battlefields littered with rusted scrap, crude idols, and the bones of anything unlucky enough to stand in their path. And among these rising tribes came the first whispers of hierarchy, not born of strategy or diplomacy, but of whoever hit hardest. The biggest Orks naturally commanded, towering above their lesser kin with scars, broken tusks, and monstrous grins. They roared orders not through words but through the sheer force of their presence. Where their fists landed, followers gathered. Where their boots stomped, paths were carved. Around them, the primordial concept of the Waaagh took shape, a psychic storm of rage and excitement, binding the species together through an energy older than reason. There were no songs, no scriptures, no wise elders telling stories. There was only the stomping rhythm of 100 feet, the guttural laughter of green-shaped chaos, and the undeniable truth that the universe itself trembled when too many of them gathered in one place. Their wills merged, their emotions fused, their dreams, if such things could be, called dreams, aligned into one unstoppable demand: fight. And so, the tribes grew. Across barren asteroid fields, fungal swamps, irradiated wastelands, and broken hive factories, they multiplied. Each planet touched by their spores became a world slowly reshaped into something loud, brutal, and alive. Structures emerged, but they were never symmetrical or planned. They were built through raw force, hammered plates, bent metal, scrap welded by sparks and shouting. Nothing about Ork society made sense to outside eyes, yet somehow everything worked. Weapons fired when they shouldn't. Engines roared even when logic said they shouldn't even exist. Machines ran not on fuel, but on the sheer, unstoppable belief of the creatures building them. To understand orcs is to enter a cosmos where the impossible becomes routine, where chaos becomes order, where stupidity becomes a strange and terrifying kind of brilliance. It is to see a species so committed to war that even the laws of physics bow under the weight of their enthusiasm. In this first hour of the tale, the galaxy sits on the precipice of understanding this truth. The orcs are not merely a race, not merely a threat, not merely loud, green brutes. They are a force of nature. They are the storm. And whether the stars burn, the Imperium rises or falls, or the warp changes shape itself, they will always be there. Because orcs do not evolve. They do not adapt. They simply are. And today, as the spores drift across a forgotten world, preparing to birth yet another violent age, one question begins to echo again, this time louder, heavier, more menacing. It's a ridiculous idea on the surface. Orcs and thinking rarely belong in the same sentence, but sometimes the universe arranges itself in strange, unsettling ways. And every once in a while, a spark flickers inside a creature never meant to grasp anything beyond smashing, shouting, and the simple joy of bashing skulls. That spark doesn't turn them wise. It doesn't make them enlightened. But it does make them dangerous, because an orc with a thought is the beginning of something the galaxy is never prepared for. You're about to hear how such a spark formed on a forgotten world, a fungal wasteland lost behind dust storms and broken continents. The kind of place the Imperium never bothers to catalog. The kind of place the Eldar sense and avoid. A world where silence existed for thousands of years, until the first spores awoke beneath its dead soil. But before we descend into the rising chaos of this rebirth, here's your reason to stay until the final moment. By the end of this full story, you will understand a terrifying truth about orcs that even the Imperium refuses to admit, because admitting it would mean accepting that the galaxy's loudest monsters might be evolving. If you stay with this tale to the end, you'll walk away with a piece of orc lore so rare, so unsettling, and so lore-breaking that it changes the way every other story about them feels. For now, picture this world, though not with images, only with sound and atmosphere. Wind dragging over cracked plains. The faint hiss of spores splitting open. Tiny green forms dragging themselves through dust. They begin as nothing more than squirming scraps of instinct, but instinct is all they need. Instinct drives them to gather. Instinct drives them to grow. Instinct drives them to fight, even when there is nothing to fight but each other. Every punch, every stomp, every roar becomes an announcement to the planet. The orcs have returned. From the shadows of canyons and underground caves, they gather in primitive mobs. Their movements are clumsy at first, uncoordinated, directionless. But with each brawl, each broken jaw, each cracking skull, a strange order emerges. Not planned, not discussed, simply felt. Something ancient hums beneath their thoughts, older than the world they stand on, older than the species that fear them. The primal heartbeat of the Krurk, the might that once shook star systems, begins, quietly, subtly, to stir again. And in the center of this crude, growing mass of green stands one orc who should never have been different. One who should have been just as loud, just as stupid, just as simple as the rest. But when he cracks open the skull of the first challenger he ever defeats, something unusual flickers behind his eyes. A moment of stillness, a moment of thinking, and that moment becomes the seed of a destiny that will one day ripple across the stars. For now, though, his name doesn't matter. Not yet. What matters is that this single, accidental spark will become the first catalyst in a chain reaction that pushes the galaxy toward a Waaagh. Unlike anything it has seen in 10,000 years. And the most unsettling part, the galaxy will not realize what is coming until it is already too late. The orc who would one day change the fate of an entire world did not begin as anything impressive. In the earliest cycles of his existence, he was simply one green body among many, another crude creature dragged from the soil by the instinctive hunger of the species. He grew fast, as all orcs do, but size alone did not set him apart. What set him apart was the way he looked at the world, in the brief moments between fights. While the others roared and smashed and reveled in their newborn violence, he often paused, not long, just a heartbeat's worth of hesitation, but long enough for something in his mind to shift. When he fought well. Brutally. Efficiently. But there was a rhythm in the way he swung his fists, as if some hidden part of him was counting, measuring, learning. Orcs weren't meant to learn, they were meant to know, tactically gifted by the ancient engineering of the old ones. But this orc wasn't relying on instinct alone. He studied, in the crude, accidental way a storm studies the land it tears through. And in every clash he improved, becoming harder, faster, more deliberate. The others began noticing him. Not with approval, orcs rarely admire anything they can't punch, but with the instinctive awareness that he was different. Their reactions were mixed. Some challenged him, some avoided him, some followed him without knowing why. But he did not yet lead. Leadership was something earned through overwhelming force, not quiet abnormality. Still, the planet itself seemed to respond to him. As he grew, the Waaagh energy around him thickened subtly, stirring in the soil and air. The fungus grew richer where he walked. The squigs grew fatter, more aggressive. Even the smallest grots scurried after him like nervous shadows, sensing a shift in the primal patterns that governed orc life. When he killed his third opponent, a hulking orc twice his size whose jaw he shattered with a single upward strike, the mob paused. Not because the violence surprised them, but because they sensed something changing in the air. His fist had not just landed with brute strength, it had landed with purpose. The sound of the blow echoed differently. Heavy, final, as though something ancient had approved. He felt it too, a low vibration under his skin, a thrum behind his eyes. Not thought, never thought, but a pressure. A rising energy that made his muscles tighten and his breath deepen. It was as if the planet itself pushed power into him, urging him forward, preparing him for something far larger than this first primitive tribe could comprehend. Days passed, and the tribe grew. More spores cracked open, more young orcs joined the swelling mob, adding their bellows to the growing cacophony. The ecosystem around them began to transform, the world adapting to orc presence as all worlds eventually do. Forests became fungal groves, rivers thickened with green slime. Predators either mutated into savage beasts willing to fight orcs or were hunted to extinction within weeks. And through it all, the strange orc grew stronger. Not just in body, but in presence. When he roared, others roared back with instinctive loyalty. When he moved toward a fight, dozens followed without hesitation. He did not claim leadership, but leadership grew around him like a shadow stretching in the light of a rising sun. It was only a matter of time before a real challenger appeared, one who would either crush him or confirm what the others had already begun to sense, that this orc was not merely different. He was becoming important, and on a world of constant violence, importance was the first step toward destiny. The turning point came on a dusk lit by the sickly glow of twin moons, one cracked, the other leaking pale light like a wounded eye. The mob had gathered in their usual way, with punches, shouts, and arguments that made no sense yet resolved everything through sheer noise. But beneath the usual chaos, a tension simmered. The orcs felt it in their bones, in the twitch of their fingers, in the restless grind of their tusks. Something was coming. That something was Grimskag our Red Jaw. He emerged from the far rocks like a walking mountain, every part of him soaked in violence. His jaw, stained a permanent shade of dried crimson, jutted out in a brutal bite that looked as if he had torn his own teeth into sharper shapes. His skin was darker than the others, scarred from battles so vicious they seemed almost unbelievable for orcs this young. Around him, lesser orcs followed with the kind of fear-coated loyalty usually reserved for bosses who ruled through pain alone. Grimskag was not clever, he was not cunning, but he was enormous, and in orc culture, that was often all the philosophy required. He stomped into the center of the mob and bellowed his challenge, a roar so powerful it shook dust from the cliffs and made several grots keel over in fright. The sound spread like a shockwave, rolling through the horde with a force that demanded an answer. The strange orc, still unnamed, still rising, stood silently at the edge of the crowd. He didn't roar back. He didn't pound his chest. He simply watched, and that alone caused a murmur to ripple through the mob. Orcs should not watch. Orcs should act. Yet he stood still, sizing Grimskag up with a calm that felt deeply unnatural to his kind. Grimskag took this stillness as an insult, and in orc culture, an insult was a promise of violence. He charged. The ground trembled beneath his thunderous steps, each one cracking dead earth. The mob roared in anticipation, not out of fear but out of joy. This was the kind of moment orcs existed for. A real fight. A fight that would shape the future of their tribe. But the strange orc did not rush to meet him. He waited, eyes narrowing, shoulders lowering. For a fleeting heartbeat, he seemed to understand the perfect moment, something instinct and something else mixed together. Something rare. Grimskag swung first, a brutal hammer of a fist meant to crush bone and send teeth flying. But the strange orc moved, not with grace, not with elegance, but with an efficiency orcs were never meant to have. He ducked beneath the blow, letting it sail harmlessly over him, and drove his forehead upward in a single devastating strike. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Grimskag stumbled, confused more than hurt. Orcs rarely felt pain the way other beings did, but they recognized surprise, and surprise was far worse. The mob yelled louder, sensing the shift in the fight. The strange orc followed through in a way that seemed almost impossible for his kind. He hit Grimskag again, and again. His fists weren't just heavy, they were deliberate. He aimed for joints, for the throat, for weak points an orc should never notice. He fought like someone who remembered something ancient buried in his blood. Grimskag tried to rally, roaring in fury, swinging wildly. But each swing left an opening, and each opening became an opportunity. The strange orc stepped inside the final, desperate punch and unleashed a blow straight to Grimskag's jaw, the blow that would define his future. The jaw shattered. A spray of broken teeth and blood marked the moment the fight ended. Grimskag collapsed, not dead but stripped of everything that made him powerful in the eyes of orcs. The mob stared in stunned silence. Not because they hadn't seen someone lose before, but because they had never seen someone win like that. The strange orc stood over Grimskag, breathing slow and steady, as if the fight had been merely a necessary task. Something deep in the crowd shifted, loyalty. Recognition. The primal certainty that this orc was different, and different meant strong, and strong meant boss. A ripple spread outward, an idea forming, a name beginning to build itself in the collective orc psyche. The strange orc did not notice any of it. He simply turned and walked toward the center of the tribe as if the outcome had always been obvious. For the first time, the mob followed. The mob continued to follow him long after Grimskag's broken form had stopped moving. There was no ceremony, no speech, no triumphant roar. Orcs didn't need declarations, they needed presence. And the strange orc's presence filled the air like a rising storm front. The others moved behind him without understanding why, driven by a mixture of instinct and something older, something in their bones whispering that this one was meant to lead. He didn't look back to make sure they followed. He didn't need to. Leadership clung to him as naturally as fungus clung to rusted metal. Each step he took stamped authority deeper into the ground, and by the time he reached the dead center of the tribe's territory, a flat plain littered with the bones of creatures the orcs no longer remembered fighting, the mob had become a unified mass. No arguments, no side brawls, no wandering. A rare moment of focus settled over them, sharper than anything their simple minds could consciously create. The strange orc stopped walking, and the entire mob stopped behind him. For a long moment, there was silence. The sickly wind swept over the cracked earth, carrying dust and spores through the air. Even the squigs seemed to sense something changing. They remained still instead of snapping at each other's legs. The world watched, though it had no eyes. It listened, though it had no ears. Then he raised one fist. Not high, not dramatically, just enough. The mob erupted in a roar so loud it felt like the planet itself shook. It wasn't a cheer, it wasn't celebration, it was recognition, raw, instinctive, unstoppable recognition. They had chosen their boss, and in Ork culture, the moment of choosing was more sacred than any ritual of any other species. A boss was not elected. A boss was not appointed. A boss was inevitable, and the mob accepted that inevitability with deafening approval. He didn't roar with them. His stillness was its own kind of dominance. But something inside him responded, the hum in his bones, the ancient pull of the Waaagh. Energy swirling around his developing mind. Power seeped into him, not from any external source, but from the mob's belief. Orks shaped reality through will, and right now, 1,000 wills bowed toward him. That was the moment he became their boss. Of course, Ork bosses don't exist in peace. The instant he rose above the others, the world began reshaping itself to test him. Fights increased. Food grew scarce. Predators appeared from burrows that had been dormant for years. Natural disasters, if anything on an Ork world could be called natural, began striking harder and more frequently. It was as if the planet, infused with Ork psychic energy, began forging him through hardship, sharpening him like a blade meant for much larger battles. And he adapted. Each fight made him stronger. Each challenge made him smarter, though, smart, for an Ork was less a matter of intellect and more a matter of efficiency. He learned unusual tactics not through thinking, but through repetition. He began to use the terrain around him with surprising effectiveness. He started recognizing patterns in enemy movement. And when the others watched him, they picked up those habits too, mimicking his combat instincts like a mob-wide echo. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The mob quieted, their instincts tuning to him like predators sensing an alpha. For the first time, he felt something new. The pull of direction, not thought, not strategy, something deeper. His head turned, not because he wanted to look somewhere, but because something made him look. Far beyond the valley, past the fungal forests and the jagged mountains, a faint glow shimmered on the horizon. Not a natural glow, not one born of fungus or storms. This light was artificial. The boss stared at it, unaware of what it meant. But the Waaagh energy inside him surged. The mob around him felt the change. A wave of tension rolled through their muscles. Their eyes sharpened. Their breathing deepened. Every Ork present sensed one thing. There was something out there worth fighting. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know who made it. They didn't know how far it lay. But they felt it. The boss grunted, a low, simple noise, but it carried across the valley with the weight of prophecy. The tribe responded instantly. Weapons were raised. Squigs leapt into the air, snapping at anything that moved. The air thickened with expectation. And with that single grunt, their entire world changed direction. For the Orks, instinct and fate were indistinguishable. And right now, their instincts told them the truth. There was another presence on this planet. Not Orks, not predators, something else. Something that did not belong. And anything that didn't belong was something to conquer. The boss descended the ridge, and the tribe flowed after him like a green tidal wave. They moved with a unity that should not have been possible. Their footsteps shook loose dust from ancient ruins buried beneath the soil. Their roars stirred the winds. The glow in the distance flickered again, brighter this time, pulsing like a heartbeat. They marched toward it with growing hunger. Hours later, as they crossed into a new stretch of wild terrain, an area untouched even by Orkish spores, the earth beneath their feet changed. The ground here was metallic, flat, artificial, something built long before the Orks existed on this world. The boss crouched and ran his thick fingers along the surface. It hummed. The metal was warm, alive. Beneath the surface, machinery stirred, slowly, groaning awake. Lights glimmered beneath the dust. Symbols barely visible through layers of time began to glow with faint blue lines. The Orks didn't know what it was. But the galaxy did. The Orks had stumbled onto something ancient. Something technological. Something dangerous. A forgotten human research outpost. A crashed Xenos craft. A Necron structure beginning to stir. A Mechanicus relic vault long buried. The boss didn't know. He didn't care. All he knew was this. If it hummed, if it glowed, if it existed, it was meant to be smashed, looted, or claimed. The Waaagh. Inside him surged with anticipation. And for the first time, the planet responded with fear. Not just stronger, not just louder, but actually smarter, or at least, smart by Ork standards. That's where our next story begins, with a warboss named Gorgat, Thinkin' One. And yes, that nickname alone should make you suspicious. Gorgat wasn't born special. In fact, he started as a surprisingly average boy. He punched loudly, he shouted randomly, and he fought anything that entered his shadow. But one day, during a raid on a heavily defended Mechanicus outpost, Gorgat did something no one expected. He survived a direct cognitive shock blast from a damaged noospheric relay. The blast fried half his skull, welded scrap into his cranium, and likely rattled whatever organs Orks use for thinking. And yet, instead of turning him into a drooling grot-level mop, the incident awakened something strange. Gorgat began asking questions. Why shoot this gun when dat gun looks shootier? Why run straight when flanking gets me closer to Crumpin? Why fight da humies, when deer are bigger humies over deer? To the other Orks, this was both confusing and fascinating. A boy who thinks. That was practically sorcery. But thinking didn't make Gorgat weak, far from it. His newfound tendency to use da brain thing helped him rise through the ranks faster than any knob could stop him. Every plan he made worked. Every ambush hit harder than the last. Every fight led him to bigger enemies, louder battles, and more territory to call his own. But here's where the tragedy, or comedy, of Ork destiny kicks in. Because no matter how clever Gorgat got, no matter how calculated his moves became, he could never escape the one truth written into Ork biology. Orks are born for war, and their cleverness exists only to make their violence more effective. And Gorgat learned this the hard way. His brightest plan, an elaborate maneuver involving decoy trucks, rigged explosives, and a fake retreat, worked flawlessly. He devastated an elite Astra Militarum regiment almost effortlessly. But when the smoke cleared, when the battlefield was nothing but scorched metal and cinder, Gorgat looked over the scene and felt disappointed. Not because the humans survived. Not because the plan failed. But because it worked too well. He realized something dangerous. If he kept thinking this much, if he kept trying to outsmart every enemy, eventually, he'd run out of fun fights. And for an Ork, that's a fate worse than death. So Gorgat, the thinker, did something only a truly smart Ork would do. He stopped thinking. He threw away his maps. He burned his plans. He punched his lieutenants for calling him a genius. And he led his entire Waaagh into the nearest hostile zone with no strategy beyond. DA1WHO hits DA hardest wins. In abandoning intelligence, he found his truest form. In rejecting cleverness, he became unstoppable. And in the end, the only thing Gorgat ever outsmarted was himself. The galaxy still whispers about the warboss who briefly defied Ork nature, only to come back stronger the moment he embraced it. Because at the end of the day, an Ork doesn't need to be smart. He just needs to be loud, green, and moving forward. Then buckle in, because this is the tale of Ugrak one more time, the Ork who simply refused to stay dead, so persistently that even the warp started getting annoyed. Ugrak wasn't famous because he was the biggest, or the smartest, or even the loudest. He was famous because every time someone killed him, and many tried, he just got back up. Not slowly. Not dramatically. He didn't stagger around coughing up fungus. He simply snapped awake and yelled, "What? I'm not done crumpin'. and rejoined the fight. At first, his fellow orcs assumed he was simply too stupid to understand death. When a space marine slammed a chainsword into his chest, Ugrak fell, twitched, and then leapt right back to his feet. When an Eldar ranger put a round straight through his skull, Ugrak collapsed, blinked once, and muttered, "Dat tickled," before charging again. Even a Carnifex goring him straight through the torso only delayed him long enough to yank himself off the claws and scream, "Me turn." To the orcs, this made him glorious. To everyone else, it made him a nightmare. But here's where things get truly bizarre. On one infamous battlefield, an Imperial medic swore he watched Ugrak die 7 times in a single hour. Not metaphorically. Not, almost. He clinically declared the orc dead, no pulse, no breath, no visible brain function. And each time, the orc just rebooted. Like some savage piece of organic machinery forced back into operation by pure stubbornness. This led to whispered speculation among Imperial psychers, who could sense something swirling around Ugrak, something wrong. Some thought he was unconsciously drawing on the Waaagh, like a living battery. Others believed Gork and Mork themselves had shoved something into his soul as a cosmic joke. A few even suggested he was partially unstuck from reality, refusing to sync with the concept of mortality. But Ugrak didn't care. He didn't know. He didn't even understand the concept of a why. All he knew was this. Every time he fell, he thought of an enemy he hadn't punched yet. And that was enough to snap him back to life. His legend spread across war zones like a plague. Enemy commanders began issuing special orders whenever Ugrak was confirmed on the field. If you kill him, shoot him again. If he falls, stomp him. Twice. If he stops moving, retreat until you're sure. And still, it didn't matter. Some claim Ugrak is still out there, fighting somewhere in the grim dark void, reincarnating himself one battle at a time. Some say he was finally vaporized by an exterminatus strike, only for a green fist to punch out of the ashes moments later. And a few insist he can't die because he doesn't know how. But the theory orcs themselves believe, the one they chant when they tell his tale around crackling fires and looted machinery. Ugrak ain't dead, till he's bored. And boredom is the one enemy he's never had to fight. What happens when his brain, already a volatile psychic pressure cooker, glimpses something he was never meant to understand? That brings us to the disturbing legend of Snagga, the weird boy who saw too much, and came back babbling things that made even other orcs uncomfortable. Snagga wasn't born strange. He became strange. It started on a battlefield drenched in psychic residue, the kind only left behind when sorcerers, demons, and things without names tear each other apart. The ground crackled, the air twisted, and space itself looked like it was bleeding. Most orcs barely noticed, they were too busy fighting. But Weirdboys, they feel everything, every flicker, every ripple, every whisper. Snagga felt it all at once. One moment he was channeling Waaagh energy to blast a group of poor guardsmen into something resembling wet mulch. The next moment, the warp opened in front of him, not like a portal, not like a tear. More like an eye. A giant, shimmering, cosmic pupil staring directly into his mind. And Snagga stared back. What did he see? Even orcs don't agree. But they all agree on one thing. When he returned, he wasn't the same. He didn't laugh. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He whispered. And nothing unnerves an orc more than whispering. His new voice was thin and shaky, like he was afraid of being heard by something following him. He muttered things in old orcish dialects no one had spoken for millennia. He drew strange symbols in the dirt, symbols no orc claimed to recognize, but some of them looked uncomfortably similar to the forbidden glyphs found carved into ancient Xeno ruins. Warbosses hated him, but they couldn't get rid of him. Why? Because he started making predictions. And they kept coming true. He predicted ambushes before they happened. He pointed at weak spots in enemy armor no orc should have known existed. He warned of incoming artillery seconds before it hit. He even predicted when other orcs would die, sometimes minutes before it happened. And then came the prophecy that sealed his fate. Snag-a-eye froze in the middle of a battlefield, his body twitching like he was being electrocuted from the inside. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. And in a voice that did not sound like his own, he uttered a single sentence that spread across orc kind like wildfire. "Da day is comin', when even da orcs will stop laughin'." A chilling hush fell over the mob. Orcs don't fear much, but the idea of a future where they couldn't laugh, that was heresy. Some mobs tried to kill Snag-a-eye right there. Some tried to run from him. A few wanted to protect him, believing he carried a message from Gork and Mork themselves. But Snag-a-eye didn't wait for any of them. He wandered off alone, stepping into the fog of battle as if following a voice only he could hear. Some swear he disappeared before their eyes, phased out, consumed by whatever entity had touched his mind. Others say he simply walked into the warp, smiling faintly as if he finally understood something no mortal, no orc, should ever comprehend. And perhaps the strangest part, every Weirdboy since then has occasionally twitched, stared into the distance, and whispered a single phrase under their breath, as if remembering something passed down through a psychic echo. "Da day is comin'," not their defeat, because orcs don't lose. Not their extinction, because they grow back like weeds. I mean the actual end. The moment when the entire species stands on the edge of something so massive, so unstoppable, that even they pause, just for a heartbeat. This is the story orcs whisper only when the fires burn low, when the Mekboys, machines finally sputter quiet, and when even the Weirdboys shiver for no reason they can explain. A story they claim isn't prophecy, isn't myth, but a memory from a future that hasn't happened yet. A future called the Last Waaagh. The Waaagh, that never ended. It begins not with a battle, but with a sound. A thrum. A vibration in the bones of the universe. Not from the stars, not from the warp, but from the orcs themselves. Every orc, everywhere, waking from sleep, from a fight, from a punch to the face, suddenly freezing mid-motion. Not in fear, not in confusion, but in recognition, as if something ancient buried deep inside their fungal DNA had just switched on. And then, without orders, without leaders, without reason, they begin walking. Across continents, across planets, across entire sectors, a tide of green bodies flowing in a direction no map could describe. Billions moving as one, pulled toward a point in space by an instinct older than every battle they've ever fought. At the center of this cosmic migration stands a figure orcs have no name for. Some call it a prime boss. Some claim it's the first orc ever grown by the Brain Boys. A few even whisper it's a physical shard of Gork and Mork fused together, a creature shaped like an orc but towering like a god. The truth, no one knows. Not even the orcs. All they know is this. When it roars, entire moons crack. When it laughs, stars flicker. When it stamps its foot, reality coughs. And the orcs answer. The Waaagh. Energy builds, not like a psychic storm, not like a weapon, but like a heartbeat sinking across the entire galaxy. The warp trembles. Demons retreat. Eldar farseers scream as visions overload their minds. Necron tombs flicker as if time itself miscalculates. Every power of the galaxy senses something coming. Something unthinkable. Something final. But here's the part orcs never talk about. The part they don't understand. The part that makes even the biggest knob quiet. The more orcs gather, the stranger things become. Colors warp. Gravity bends. Time skips. And the Waaagh keeps growing. Growing beyond physics. Beyond logic, beyond even the warp. Some say the orcs are building toward one single punch, one cosmic swing meant to shatter the universe into something better, something louder, something more fun. Others believe they're inadvertently summoning Gork and Mork into reality through sheer collective will. But the darkest interpretation, the Waaagh, is not rising to fight something. It's rising to contain something. Because Snag-a-eye's warning, Da day is comin' when even da orks will stop laughin', was not about fear. It was about silence. A silence too heavy for laughter. Too large for joy. Too final even for the orks. The last Waaagh is the moment orc kind meets something they cannot punch, cannot shout at, cannot overpower. Something only they can hold back, because only they are chaotic, loud, and infinite enough to do it. And that's why, they say, the Waaagh never ends. It can't. If it did, everything else would. Whether this future ever arrives, or has already happened somewhere outside of time, no one knows. Maybe the orcs don't either. Maybe they march because it's fun. Maybe they march because the galaxy needs them. Or maybe they march because everything, even chaos, has a purpose. A purpose buried deep in green skin, roaring lungs, and a hunger for eternal battle. In the end, the orcs don't worry about the meaning. They don't worry about the danger. They don't worry about the end. They only know one truth. If the last Waaagh ever stops, the galaxy will too. And so they keep marching. They keep fighting. They keep laughing. Because as long as orcs laugh, the universe still breathes.